Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Imagine you are scrolling through your social media feed right now.
Oh, we all know that feeling.
Right. And a prominent church leader, someone with a large platform, just made a highly controversial pastoral decision. Maybe it was a nuanced theological statement.
Or perhaps they chose to partner with an organization that some people find questionable.
Yeah, and within seconds, the comment section turns into an absolute war zone. You see paragraphs of furious text flying back and
It
forth.
is wild to watch.
It really is. People are using words like heretic, compromiser, coward, and agent of hell. Now, ask yourself a crucial question as you watch this unfold. Is the person typing those furious, blistering comments acting out of a pure, righteous zeal to protect the truth of the gospel?
Or, and this is the scary alternative, are they infected with a spiritual disease so deceptive, so perfectly camouflaged that it mimics absolute holiness while actually destroying the soul?
Wow, that is a heavy thought.
It is. The terrifying reality is that from the outside, righteous zeal and demonic pride often look virtually identical. I mean, they both care about truth. They both use scripture. They both seem highly motivated.
So, for you, living in an era of intense religious observation and, frankly, absolute information overload, discerning your own internal motives is a vital, ongoing task.
Absolutely. We live in a culture that incentivizes outrage. We see people constantly evaluating the faith of others online, in local congregations, and in public forums.
But we rarely have the tools to evaluate the unseen engine driving our own actions.
That is the real issue. The danger is not usually that you will suddenly abandon your faith. The danger is that your faith becomes a weapon used to elevate yourself while tearing down the bride of Christ.
Okay, let's unpack this. To figure out how to diagnose the human heart, we are looking at a highly detailed historical text today.
Yes, we have a document written by Jonathan Edwards. He lived from 1703 to 1758. And he wrote this specific text, which is a fourth part of his account, during a massive religious revival.
Right, the Great Awakening in New England. And the mission for today's deep dive is to examine this specific text to see how Edwards distinguishes between spiritual pride and pure Christian humility.
And we are going to find that the differences require a spiritual MRI to detect. But before we get into the text itself, we really need to understand the world Edwards was living in.
Yeah, why did he feel compelled to write a diagnostic manual for the soul in the first place?
Well, you have to picture the sheer chaos and the overwhelming emotional weight of the 1740s in New England. Edwards was watching a massive, unprecedented religious movement unfold right in front of him.
It was huge. You had itinerant preachers like George Whitefield speaking to crowds of thousands in open fields.
People were having intense physical reactions to the preaching of the gospel. I mean, they were weeping, crying out in anguish over their sin, and experiencing moments of absolute ecstatic joy.
Churches were completely full, and religious talk was happening in the taverns, in the streets, and in the homes. It was a true awakening.
But Edwards, with his incredibly sharp pastoral eye, noticed a fatal problem emerging within the ranks of the most zealous converts. Alongside genuine spirit-wrought faith, a counterfeit was growing rapidly.
He started seeing people who had these massive emotional experiences suddenly acting incredibly arrogant, right? They thought they had reached some elevated plane of existence.
Precisely. You had a group of people, often referred to as the New Lights, who were fully on board with the revival, but some of them took their newfound zeal and turned it into a bludgeon.
Oh, wow. So they used it against others.
Yeah, they started looking at the established ministers, the older folks in the pews, or anyone who was not weeping and crying out, and they labeled them as cold, dead, or unconverted.
So Edwards realized that the greatest threat to the revival was not the secular critics outside the church. It was the spiritual pride masquerading as advanced holiness inside the church.
Spot on. He wrote this text to give you a diagnostic tool. He wants you to be able to tell whether your religious zeal is actually pure heaven-born humility or if it is just your own ego wearing a very convincing disguise.
Edwards begins this diagnosis by looking at the inward focus of humility versus the outward fixation of pride. He points out that spiritual pride causes a person to speak frequently about the faults of others.
And the defining characteristic is not just that they point out the faults, it is the specific tone they use to do it.
Right. Edwards says the proud person speaks of the sins of others with bitterness, or with a strange levity and lightness, or with an air of contempt.
Pure Christian humility, on the other hand, makes a person entirely silent about the faults of others. Or, if they are absolutely required to speak, they do so with grief and pity.
It is a completely different orientation of the heart.
Think about the psychological mechanics happening here. Pride is, by its very nature, suspicious of everyone else. The proud person feels a constant need to validate their own standing by proving that others are failing.
They become self-appointed inspectors of everyone else's spiritual temperature.
Well, precisely. They observe how cold and dead other Christians seem, and they cry out against them, sharply reproving them. They scan the horizon, looking for theological errors or behavioral missteps.
But the humble saint operates in the exact opposite manner. The humble person is jealous or highly suspicious of their own heart.
They are so busy looking at their own mess that they do not have time to police the neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. The humble Christian is constantly looking inward at the radical corruption of their own nature.
They are aware that, apart from the intervening grace of God, their heart is an active factory of idolatry. This is the reality of total human depravity.
Because they are so occupied with sweeping the floor of their own house, they simply lack the time, the energy, or the inclination to stare out the window and critique how their neighbor is sweeping theirs.
That brings up a crucial question about human nature in our default settings. Edwards makes a statement that feels completely backward to modern psychology.
Oh, I know the one you mean. He says that in a person's clearest discoveries of God's glory, and in their most rapturous, elevated spiritual frames, they are actually most overwhelmed with a sense of their own vileness.
Yes, they feel the absolute lowest self-abasement.
I want to linger on this because it is fascinating. You might expect that a massive spiritual high, a true mountaintop experience with God, would make someone feel invincible, angelic, or supremely confident in their own righteousness.
To understand why Edwards says this, you have to look at the mechanism of how grace actually operates on the human mind. Think of it like coming in from the dark.
Okay, I am tracking with you.
If you have been sitting in a dimly lit, dusty room for days, your white shirt probably looks fairly clean to you. Your baseline for cleanliness is skewed by the darkness.
Right, because you cannot see the details.
But if you suddenly step outside into absolute blinding, pure high noon sunlight, what happens? You do not suddenly feel cleaner. The sunlight reveals every single stain, every speck of dust, and every terrifying flaw in that shirt.
The light does not create the dirt. It just exposes what was already there, hidden by the shadows.
Yes, God's glory is that pure, blinding sunlight. Without God's grace, our hearts are completely bent away from Him. Every single faculty of our nature, our mind, our will, our emotions, is infected by rebellion.
This is the reality of our condition. We are entirely incapable of generating pure righteousness on our own.
So when a believer actually catches a genuine glimpse of the absolute purity, majesty, and holiness of God, the only logical response is a crushing awareness of their own stark contrast to that purity.
This brings to mind the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament. He sees the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, with the angels crying, "Holy, holy, holy."
And Isaiah does not say, "Wow, look at me, I made it into the throne room."
Right. His immediate reaction is, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips."
That is the universal pattern of true encounters with the divine. The closer you get to the light, the larger your own shadow appears to you.
And that changes how you view other people. The humble person who sees their own massive flaws clearly in the light of God's holiness naturally esteems others better than themselves.
They easily take notice of what is good in others, and they hyper-focus on what is wrong in themselves. The proud person does the reverse.
Because they are standing in the shadows of their own ego, they ignore their own flaws and use a magnifying glass to examine the flaws of the people around them.
It is a terrifying mirror to hold up to ourselves.
I have to push back here, though. Or at least I need to voice the objection that I know many listeners are thinking right now. Isn't calling out sin a clear biblical mandate?
That is a very fair point to raise.
I read Edwards saying that humility causes a person to be silent or speak with grief, and it sounds like he is advocating for total passivity. If a church leader is genuinely misleading people, or if someone is acting in a way that destroys the community, how do we handle that?
It is a delicate balance, for sure.
Because if I use strong language, I am diagnosed as proud. But if I say nothing and let wolves devour the sheep, I am negligent. I look at this and I think about how spiritual pride operates like a medical phenomenon, specifically a spiritual autoimmune disease.
Break that medical analogy down a bit further. How does it apply to the church?
Well, in the human body, an autoimmune disorder happens when your immune system loses its ability to distinguish between foreign, dangerous cells and your own healthy cells.
Right, the body gets confused about what the actual threat is.
The body creates autoantibodies that attack normal, healthy organs. The body attacks itself, thinking it is fighting off a lethal infection, but is actually destroying healthy tissue.
And in a church context, the proud person has this hyperactive immune response.
Spot on. They think they're defending the bride of Christ by attacking everyone else's faults, by calling out every minor theological discrepancy, but they're actually tearing the congregation apart from the inside.
They are rogue white blood cells.
Well, absolutely. But the body does need a functioning immune system. We
Yeah.
do need to fight off actual viruses. So how do we reconcile Edward's call for silence with the need to address actual fatal error?
You reconcile it by examining the underlying motivation driving the immune response.
Yeah.
Edwards is absolutely not forbidding church discipline. He is not saying you should ignore false teaching.
So he is not asking for passivity.
Not at all. He is giving you a tool to diagnose the disposition of your heart while you are engaging in that necessary correction. When the proud person corrects someone, they do it with a distinct sense of superiority.
They often find a sick kind of joy or satisfaction in pointing out the failure.
They act as if they are entirely immune to the same temptations. They are the rogue white blood cell destroying the organ because they view the organ as an enemy.
They feel victorious when they expose a flaw.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. But when the eminently humble person is forced by duty and love to correct a fault, they do it with a shattered heart.
They approach the situation knowing their own capacity for the same sin, or even worse sins.
They speak with tears, not with a sneer. They esteem the other person better than themselves, recognizing that any theological accuracy or behavioral obedience they possess is entirely unmerited favor from God.
If you are going to amputate a limb to save a life, you do not do it laughing. You do it weeping.
That is a brilliant way to summarize it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Edwards moves from the inward disposition to the actual words we use. He looks at the specific vocabulary of condemnation.
This is where it gets very practical.
He says it is a glaring mark of spiritual pride to speak of what you see amiss in others using the most harsh, severe, and terrible language. The proud person will look at the opinions, the conduct, the caution, the moderation, or the prudence of others and declare that those things are from the devil or from hell.
They use words like devilish, hellish, or cursed so frequently that these words become the standard vocabulary in their mouths.
They label anyone who disagrees with them or anyone who moves at a slower, more careful pace as a literal agent of the enemy.
We see this constantly today. The use of extreme apocalyptic language for every disagreement is a telltale sign of a heart that has elevated itself to the position of the supreme judge.
When you use the word hellish to describe a fellow believer's genuine attempt to figure out a tricky situation, you are not engaging in correction. You are engaging in condemnation.
And Edwards notes that this venom is especially grievous when it is directed at ministers of the gospel or elders whose age and station require a baseline of respect.
Why does pride feel so comfortable bypassing that respect?
Because the proud person believes their own zeal gives them special authorization to ignore the normal rules of Christian conduct. They mistake their own fiery, aggressive temperament for righteous indignation.
They convince themselves that because the stakes are so high, they are allowed to verbally destroy a leader.
But notice what Edwards points out here. The proud person often attacks others, specifically for their caution and moderation.
Yes, that stood out to me. Why are caution and moderation such offensive concepts to the spiritually proud?
Because pride demands immediate action and immediate validation. The proud person views their own perspective as infallible.
So any delay feels like a betrayal to them.
Precisely. Therefore, if a leader says, "Let's pause, pray, and consider the long-term implications of this decision," the proud person views that caution as cowardice.
Zeal without knowledge consistently attacks wisdom.
The proud person mistakes a leader's careful prudence for spiritual coldness. They want a revolution today, and anyone standing in the way of that revolution is labeled as a compromiser.
I want you, the listener, to pause and evaluate your own internal monologue, or better yet, your habits when interacting online.
It is a tough thing to look at, honestly.
When you see a fault in a leader, or when someone exercises caution instead of jumping immediately onto your theological bandwagon, what is your visceral reaction?
Is your first instinct to post a comment labeling their action as a compromise with the devil? Do you assume the worst possible motive for their moderation?
Or do you react with grief, praying for them, and taking that moment to examine your own heart?
Look at the biblical alternative Edwards provides. He points directly to how Christ treated the Apostle Peter after Peter shamefully denied him.
We need to look closely at the psychological weight of this narrative.
Peter had committed a massive, public, catastrophic failure. He denied even knowing Jesus, with curses, right before the crucifixion. He abandoned his Lord in the most agonizing hour of history.
If anyone ever deserved harsh, severe, terrible language, it was Peter in that moment. If a modern leader failed that spectacularly, the internet would demand their immediate, permanent exile.
The gap in holiness between Christ and Peter is infinite. Jesus is the sinless Son of God. Peter is a broken, failing fisherman.
Yet how does humility incarnate handle this? Humility leads the Christian to treat others who are in fault with meekness and gentleness, just as Christ did.
In John 21, Jesus restores Peter. He does not summon lightning. He does not publicly humiliate him. He condescends to Peter's extreme weakness.
He meets him by a charcoal fire on the beach, makes him breakfast, and gently asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" He restores him gently.
He did not scream at him. He did not label his betrayal as devilish, even though it was influenced by the enemy. He showed immense, unfathomable patience.
That condescension of Christ is staggering. Condescension is not a word we use often in a positive light today.
No, we usually think of a condescending person as someone who talks down to us with a snobby attitude.
But theologically, condescension means that the sovereign, infinite God willingly lowers himself to interact with finite, broken humans on our level out of pure love.
He had every right to bring the hammer of justice down on Peter, but he chose the path of gentle restoration.
And that leads into the next major concept Edwards addresses, the performative nature of spiritual pride versus the unseen, quiet reality of the humble follower.
This is where Edwards dismantles the visual aesthetic of extreme religion. He writes that spiritual pride disposes a person to affect singularity in their manner and appearance.
The proud person wants to stand out. Their whole goal, whether they admit it to themselves or not, is to attract observation.
They want people to look at them and think, wow, what a dedicated, radical, uncompromising believer.
They adopt a specific vocabulary, a specific tone of voice, or a specific set of highly visible behaviors that broadcast their intense devotion.
It is performative Christianity. It is treating the church like a stage.
That is a great way to put it. But pure humility disposes the Christian to avoid anything that is likely to draw observation to themselves.
They do not want the spotlight. They're only singular or different from the crowd when neglecting a positive duty would be an actual sin. They do not try to look different just for the sake of looking different.
What's fascinating here is how Edwards completely takes apart the concept of the lone wolf super-Christian. You see this dynamic a lot today. There is a specific kind of pride that loves to stand at a distance from the rest of the body. They become separatists.
Why do you think that separatist urge is so strong? What is the psychology behind wanting to pull away from the visible church?
I think it comes down to a desire to be part of the pure remnant. The proud person separates from the visible, ordinary body of believers because they view everyone else as contaminated or inferior.
They look at the local congregation, which is always messy, always flawed, and always full of hypocrites in progress, and they think, I am too pure to associate with this.
They want to start their own ultra-pure group, or they just retreat into isolation, getting their theology strictly from audio programs and books where they never have to interact with a real, annoying human being.
That is a brilliant diagnosis. Pride stands on a balcony looking down, but the humble Christian looks upon themselves as far more unworthy than anyone else in the room.
They carefully shun any appearance of an open separation from visible Christians. They actively avoid trying to distinguish themselves as humbler or better.
True grace binds you to the ordinary, messy, frustrating local church. It does not pull you away into a sterile isolation. The humble person knows that they need the body, flaws and all, because they are acutely aware of the massive flaws they bring to the table.
It makes me think of an orchestra. Let's imagine a massive symphony playing a complex piece of music. Every instrument needs to be tuned to a standard pitch, usually A440.
The humble person comes in, listens to the tuning note, and adjusts their instrument to blend in with the whole. They want the symphony to sound beautiful.
But the proud person is like a badly tuned instrument played by an arrogant musician. They refuse to blend in. They bring their own pitch pipe.
They decide their tuning is the only correct one.
And instead of adjusting to the rest of the symphony, they just play louder and louder to prove that they are the only one playing the right notes. They look down on the woodwind section for being too quiet. They get angry at the brass section for being off tempo, and they entirely ignore the conductor.
That conductor being the providence of God who orchestrates the pacing of the church. The proud musician creates discord because they're obsessed with their own solo.
Edwards describes this exact dynamic using the words stiffness and inflexibility. He says that spiritual pride commonly occasions a certain stiffness in a person's judgment and their ways. They become completely rigid.
I know people like this. Every single issue is a hill to die on. There are no secondary issues.
Because for the proud person, yielding on a minor practical preference feels like a massive compromise of absolute truth.
But Edwards says that humility inclines a person to a yielding, pliable disposition. The eminently humble Christian is clothed with lowliness, mildness, meekness, and gentleness of spirit.
They have a soft, sweet, condescending, winning air and deportment. They are disposed to yield to others, to conform to them, and to please them in absolutely everything except sin.
That caveat is vital, except sin. We are not talking about abandoning biblical truth to please people.
Of course not. But outside of clear biblical commands, the humble person is incredibly flexible. They do not need to win every argument about the color of the church carpet, the order of the service, or the exact phrasing of a secondary theological concept.
They lack the roughness, the contempt, the fierceness, and the bitterness that mark spiritual pride. They know they are not the center of the universe.
And this difference in disposition becomes undeniably obvious when opposition arrives. The crucible of opposition and reproach is where the true nature of the heart is completely revealed.
It is easy to act humble when everyone agrees with you. But what happens when someone attacks you?
Edwards says that spiritual pride takes great notice of opposition and injuries. The proud person remembers every slight. They keep a mental ledger of every wrong done to them.
They speak of these injuries often, broadcasting to everyone how persecuted they are.
And they use that opposition as fuel. The proud person uses the reproach of enemies to become bolder, more confident, and to go to even greater lengths in whatever they were blamed for.
If someone criticizes them for being too harsh, they decide to become twice as harsh just to prove they will not be intimidated. They use opposition to stoke the fires of their own self-righteousness.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the theology behind how we handle suffering. We have to look at the absolute, complete sovereignty of God over all events, including the painful ones.
This is a massive theological pivot point. If God is completely sovereign over the universe, then nothing happens to you by accident.
When injuries, unjust criticisms, and fierce opposition come into your life, the humble person recognizes that God is actively ruling over those specific circumstances.
Even the unjust reproaches of bitter enemies are ordained tools meant for your sanctification. God allows the attack to chip away at your remaining pride.
That is incredibly hard to swallow when you are the one being attacked online or gossiped about in your community.
It requires supernatural grace. But look at the pattern. Humility responds like our Lord when he was reviled. When Jesus stood before his accusers, facing entirely false, malicious charges, what did he do?
He was silent. He did not open his mouth to launch a counterattack.
Edwards notes a fascinating correlation. The more clamorous and furious the world is against the humble Christian, the more silent and still that Christian will become.
They do not feel a frantic, desperate need to vindicate themselves because they fully trust the sovereign judge to handle their reputation.
I have to admit, I struggle with this concept vastly. This is so completely counterintuitive to everything in our current culture, and frankly, everything in my own human nature.
Human nature screams at you to double down when you're attacked. If someone calls you out on social media, the biological instinct is the fight-or-flight response.
You want to fight back harder, deploy a flawless argument, launch a counterattack, and prove to everyone watching that you are right and the other person is a fool.
But what does grace dictate in that moment?
Grace says, stop and look inward. Humility leads us to make use of the reproaches of enemies as an occasion for serious self-examination.
Instead of immediately planning a defense strategy, the humble person actually pauses and asks, is there any truth to this criticism?
Even if the person delivering it is angry and unfair, what is God trying to teach me through this painful interaction? It takes a massive amount of restraint to stop and examine your own motives when someone is yelling in your face.
It requires a fundamental, life-altering shift in how you view yourself before God and before humanity. It changes your entire posture in the world.
Spiritual pride leads to a certain unsuitable and self-confident boldness. The proud person assumes the air of a master.
They walk through life thinking it belongs to them to dictate to everyone else. They view themselves as the teacher in every scenario.
I love the contrast Edwards draws here. He says the eminently humble Christian feels they want help from everybody, whereas the spiritually proud person thinks everybody wants their help.
That dynamic changes the entire tone of a room. The proud person walks into a gathering, looks around, and thinks, how can I fix all these people?
How can I correct their flawed theology? How can I impart my superior wisdom to them? They speak with commands and warnings. They issue edicts.
But the humble person walks into that exact same room and thinks, what can I learn from these saints? How can their experiences help me see my own blind spots?
The humble person entreats and beseeches others under a sense of their misery. You plead with people out of genuine love. You do not command them out of a desire for control.
Edwards applies this specific dynamic to generational relationships, which provides a fantastic, highly practical test case. He talks about young ministers who experience a lot of sudden success.
We see this today with young guys who plant a church and suddenly they have a massive following.
Edwards says that even if a sovereign God chooses to grant a young minister vastly greater visible success than the older, established ministers in the area, humility dictates that the young man must still treat the aged ministers with intense respect and reverence, viewing them as fathers.
Because success does not equal superiority.
That is right. This is where theology hits a pavement. Success in ministry, or success in any spiritual endeavor, is not a marker of your inherent brilliance.
It is a pure, unadulterated display of God's unmerited favor. If God chooses to bless your efforts, that blessing does not rewrite the biblical command to honor your elders.
The proud young minister looks at his large crowd, compares it to the older pastor's small crowd, and assumes he is smarter, more faithful, or more spiritual than the older generation. He dismisses their wisdom.
The humble young minister looks at his large crowd, falls on his face in terror at the responsibility, and runs to the older pastor, begging for advice on how to handle it.
So, what does this all mean for how we interact with people completely outside the faith? Edwards has been focusing mostly on internal church dynamics, but he also addresses how we should handle skeptics, or as he calls them in the language of his day, carnal men.
This is perhaps one of the most convicting parts of his analysis. Edwards states that it is a mark of spiritual pride to refuse to enter into discourse or reasoning with people who make objections and inquiries.
The proud person thinks they are too dignified to deal with the messy questions.
Yes. The proud person views the repetitive, sometimes hostile, or sometimes just plain foolish questions of skeptics as beneath them. They dismiss them.
They might throw out a quick, highly intellectual argument, and if the skeptic does not immediately submit, the proud person walks away, shaking the dust off their feet, feeling superior.
They refuse to stoop down to the level of the person asking the questions.
But humility leads ministers, and all believers, to condescend to those outside the faith. We talked about Christ's condescension earlier with Peter. We are called to mirror that same action with the unbelieving world.
We are called to bear with their unteachableness and their stubbornness. Think about a modern scenario. You are in the workplace, and a coworker finds out you are a Christian.
They start asking you questions, but they are framing them in a hostile, mocking way. They are repeating arguments they heard on a late-night comedy show.
The proud reaction is to snap back, humiliate them with a logical fallacy point, and shut the conversation down.
Winning the battle, but losing the soul.
Precisely. The humble believer takes a totally different path. They follow the skeptic with patient instruction, line upon line, precept upon precept, saying, "Come, let us reason together."
You fulfill the biblical command to be ready always to give an answer to every man who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, doing so with meekness and fear.
This reframes the entire task of apologetics and defending the faith. If your goal in a conversation is to win a debate, to crush your opponent with your superior historical knowledge, or to look smart in front of an audience, you are operating entirely in the flesh.
You are operating in spiritual pride. But if your goal is to patiently walk alongside someone, answering their objections with gentleness, you are operating in humility.
You bear with the spiritual dullness of the skeptic for one massive, undeniable reason. You acutely remember your own spiritual dullness before God sovereignly opened your eyes.
You are extending the exact same patience to them that Jesus extended to you when you were his enemy. Apologetics is not a battle to be won. It is a patient act of love.
To recap this incredible diagnostic tool, we see a vast, unbridgeable difference between these two dispositions. Spiritual pride is loud. It is rigid.
It is highly suspicious of the motives of others. It focuses continually on the faults of everyone else, uses extreme language to condemn them, and is incredibly quick to separate and isolate.
True humility is quiet. It is pliable and flexible on secondary issues. It is highly suspicious of its own motives.
It is eager to maintain unity, it shrinks from the spotlight, and it is quick to examine itself when criticized.
As we close, This raises a vital question for you to consider as you walk through your week. Edwards leaves us with a chilling reality. He suggests that pride hides itself best not in our moments of obvious sin, but in our most zealous religious moments.
It cloaks itself in our prayers, our theological debates, and our desire for purity.
If our greatest danger isn't secular rebellion, but religious superiority, then our most urgent daily prayer shouldn't just be for more theological knowledge. Our most urgent prayer should be for the grace to suspect our own motives precisely when we feel the most righteous.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Keep your heart under the microscope, evaluate your motives with grace, and we will see you next time.